Welcome to Historic Alexandria. My name is Tim with Alexandria History Tours, and where I'm standing right here was one of the original lots in Alexandria, lot number 51. It was purchased in 1749 by one of the founders of Alexandria, a man who at that time owned a property south of here known as Mount Vernon. No, I'm not referring to George Washington. I'm referring to his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington. Lawrence was George's brother through their father, Augustine. Lawrence was 14 years older than George, and at the time in 1748-49, he was representing what would become Alexandria in the Virginia House of Burgesses. He was actually from Fairfax County, a member of the Burgesses. So he is the person that proposed the legislation that moved through the Virginia General Assembly that would ultimately establish Alexandria in 1749. Okay, so a little bit more about Lawrence Washington. Lawrence Washington was in the military. In fact, he served in the Virginia Provincial Regiment as a captain. And he specifically served during a war known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. This was a British war against Spain. Lawrence was part of the Cartagena campaign. There's a funny story about his commanding officer, the admiral that he served under. This admiral had a very specific nickname, Old Grog. It referred to the type of cloak that he wore made out of grog or gross grain. Now, what's interesting about the sailors calling him Old Grog is they then started to adopt that name for a very specific type of drink. People that are in the military, the Marine Corps, other branches may know or have heard of this drink, grog. Well, it actually goes back to the 1740s. Specifically, this admiral, he would dilute the rum rations that was given to the sailors. He diluted it with water, and he diluted it with lime. He was worried about his sailors getting too drunk. The sailors started referring to this drink as grog. We still have the name of grog to this day that comes from this specific admiral. Now, this admiral had a very specific name that you have also heard of. In fact, Lawrence ended up naming the property that he inherited from his father after this admiral. I'm referring, of course, to Admiral Edward Vernon. In 1743, when George and Lawrence's father, Augustine, died, that's when Lawrence inherited the property Little Hunting Creek. The property he renamed Mount Vernon. So I always think it's interesting that he named it Mount Vernon after Admiral Edward Vernon. He had a lot of respect and admiration for him, but he could have just as well now named it Mount Grog. I don't know about you, I think Mount Vernon has a slightly better ring to it. Nevertheless, that's a very fun story about Admiral Vernon, about Lawrence Washington, the brother of George Washington. Now, George would eventually inherit Mount Vernon. His brother Lawrence died in 1752 of tuberculosis. Who inherited Mount Vernon after that? Well, it was actually Lawrence and his wife, Anne Fairfax Washington's daughter, Sarah. Sadly, Sarah died a couple of years later. Anne Fairfax Washington inherited Mount Vernon in 1754. She leased the property to George Washington starting in that same year. She also got remarried, so she moved away from Mount Vernon. Now, Anne died in 1761. And when Anne died, that is when George Washington officially inherited Mount Vernon outright. So I really like the history of Lawrence Washington. Lawrence is often a historical figure that we don't know much about. He's not, I wouldn't say he's forgotten, but in many ways he died so young. He was 34 years old. George was only 20 years old when Lawrence died in 1752. George did consider Lawrence Washington his best friend. I like to also emphasize the role that Lawrence played in the formation of Alexandria. He represented Fairfax County in the Virginia House of Burgesses. If there's one person that we can point to that actually played the pivotal role in proposing the legislation that would create the town of Alexandria, well, let's look no further than Lawrence Washington. A lot of times we talk about the Scottish merchants that founded Alexandria. While that is true, many of the merchants played a very strong, powerful role in the development of this early town. Lawrence himself, I would say, is the founder of Alexandria, and that he was the politician that made the move to propose the town here in 1749. Well, for more stories about Alexandria, for more stories about Lawrence, George Washington, we hope you'll come visit us here in Old Town, take a tour with us at Alexandria History Tours.